In Redwood Heights, a city long plagued by prejudice, power, and greed, justice was anything but blind. When a young black woman named Dana Blake is framed for a crime she didn't commit, the entire legal system seemed determined to destroy her life. Behind the scenes, racist cops bribe a judge to ensure Dana's downfall, until an unthinkable twist changes everything. In a stunning turn of events, the very woman they sought to bury suddenly holds their future in her hands. In this story of power struggles, betrayal, and impossible comebacks, the tables turn in the most dramatic way possible. Redwood Heights was a city with a complicated history. Decades ago, it had been a thriving industrial hub, filled with bustling factories and an optimistic workforce. Over time, however, factories closed, jobs dried up, and the city's fortunes faded. The once proud neighborhoods fell prey to crime, political scheming, and unchecked corruption. Newspapers like the Redwood Heights Gazette did their best to expose misconduct, but the powers that be often twisted the truth, using old money, ties, and political influence to keep their shady dealings under wraps. Among the institutions tainted by this corruption was the Redwood Heights Police Department. Behind the well-crafted image of officers who served and protected, there lurked a small faction of crooked cops, led by Detective Kurt Dixon and Sergeant Eli Carr. This group was infamous for planting evidence on black and brown residents, turning minor offenses into life-ruining felonies, and exploiting every ounce of their power to line their pockets. Most disturbingly, it wasn't only about money. Prejudice ran deep in their ranks, fueling their willingness to harass and brutalize the most vulnerable in Redwood Heights. Dana Blake was exactly the kind of person Dixon and Carr preyed upon. A resourceful, ambitious, and compassionate woman in her early 30s, Dana had grown up in Redwood Heights. She was no stranger to its underbelly, raised by her grandmother after her parents passed away in a tragic car accident. She learned early on how to hold her head high amidst adversity. She had big dreams to study criminal justice, to rise through the ranks of the law, and ultimately to protect the very people the system often abandoned. Quietly but steadily, Dana had done just that. A star student with a fiery passion for justice, she graduated at the top of her class from Redwood Heights Community College, then went on to earn a full scholarship to a prestigious law school in Chicago. She returned to her hometown armed with knowledge, confidence, and a determination to right the wrongs she saw daily. But Redwood Heights was resistant to change. Even with her qualifications, opportunities within the local justice system were scarce for a black woman, especially one known for speaking out against police harassment. Detective Dixon had encountered Dana several times before. Whenever she witnessed or suspected foul play by officers, she was the first to raise questions, file complaints, or even organize community meetings. Dixon hated that. He considered her a nuisance, a troublemaker who threatened the good old way of doing business. And it wasn't just Dana's activism that enraged him. It was her unapologetic refusal to back down in a town that often forced marginalized people into silence. Over time, Dixon found ways to intimidate her. He'd pull her over for minor traffic infractions, glare at her in court corridors, and even spread rumors that she was involved with local gang members. Dana, however, stayed strong. She was on a path that promised change, and that change threatened to upend the shady empire Dixon and Carr had built in Redwood Heights. Eventually, her resistance made her the perfect target for one of the most sinister schemes the department had ever concocted. Detective Kurt Dixon and Sergeant Eli Carr were restless. The Redwood Heights Police Department might have had its fair share of corruption, but even among the questionable crowd, these two stood out for their brazen disregard of justice. They met one evening in the smoky back room of an old bar called Tanner's Pub. It was a low-key spot, frequented by off-duty cops looking for a stiff drink and a chance to vent about city politics. Over the years, Dixon and Carr had made that back room their private war council, where they plotted everything from small-time shakedowns to more elaborate crimes. That night, Dixon leaned forward, swirling a half-empty glass of whiskey. "She's got to go," he muttered, eyes glinting with barely contained malice. He didn't have to say who she was. Both men knew he meant Dana Blake. Carr nodded, jaw tight, as though simply thinking her name annoyed him. Dixon continued, "She's getting traction in the community. People trust her. If she keeps going, she'll push for an investigation into police conduct. You know what that means." What it meant, though unsaid, was that the skeletons in their closet would come crashing out. Years of false arrests, planted drugs, stolen evidence, and unreported bribes. If Dana found a legitimate foothold in the legal system, maybe as a city prosecutor or even an assistant district attorney, she could dismantle their entire operation. She had the knowledge, the drive, and the moral compass to do it. "We need something big," Carr hissed, tapping his empty glass against the tabletop. "She's never had so much as a parking ticket. We plan a bag of weed, and it's not going to make a dent. She'll be back in a week, her reputation intact." Dixon rubbed his temples, thinking. He'd orchestrated false charges before, but never against someone as well-connected as Dana. People respected her, even judges, in public at least, acknowledged her dedication to the law. "We got to paint her as a real criminal," he said finally. "Money laundering, drug trafficking, bribery, something that makes the city recoil in horror." They hashed out the plan for hours. By the end of the night, their whiskey glasses were empty, their cigarettes extinguished in overflowing ashtrays, and their hearts burning with hateful resolve. The scheme was straightforward, but required a conspiratorial judge to make it airtight. Dixon knew exactly where to look. Judge Kyle Pratt, a longtime ally of the corrupt cops, owed Dixon and Carr more than a few favors. Rumor had it Judge Pratt had a gambling addiction. He was deep in debt, and Dixon had once turned a blind eye when Pratt caused a DUI accident that was hushed up. So the plan was set. Dixon and Carr would fabricate evidence of large-scale drug possession or distribution pinned squarely on Dana. They would bribe or blackmail Judge Pratt into issuing a warrant, ensuring bail was denied. By the time Dana fought her way out legally, her name and her future in Redwood Heights would be destroyed. They ended the night with a secret handshake and a pair of bitter smiles. In their minds, by framing Dana Blake for a serious felony, they would kill two birds with one stone, silence the most vocal critic of their corrupt empire, and send a message to the community that no one stands in the way of Redwood Heights' dirty cops. A week after their meeting at Tanner's Pub, Dixon and Carr set the plan into motion. Their first step was to create a paper trail that would implicate Dana in illegal drug activities. Carr had a contact in a shady underworld circle, small-time criminals who owed him favors to avoid harassment or arrest. These individuals were well-versed in forging documents, and in a matter of days, they produced false ledgers, shipping receipts, and text message transcripts, connecting Dana to a fictional cell based in another state. Late one night, under the cover of darkness, Dixon and Carr broke into Dana's modest apartment. They wore gloves and black hoodies, stealthy as prowling panthers. Dixon forced open a small window, while Carr kept watch on the deserted street below. Inside, Dixon planted bags filled with a suspicious white substance baking soda carefully packaged to look like cocaine tucked away in the storage closet and under the kitchen sink. He also hid a burner phone that contained incriminating text messages, carefully dated to suggest that Dana had been orchestrating drug deals for months. The next day, Dixon submitted an anonymous tip to his own precinct's drug enforcement unit, claiming that Dana Blake was a major distributor. He made sure this tip rose through the right channels, coming to rest on the desk of an officer he trusted to keep quiet. Within hours, a police raid was scheduled. The raid itself was a spectacle. Heavily armed officers, SWAT gear, blaring sirens meant to intimidate not just Dana, but the entire community. They wanted Redwood Heights to remember the day Dana Blake was taken down. When the raid occurred, Dana was caught completely off guard. She was in the middle of drafting a community advocacy proposal in her living room when SWAT officers burst through the door, yelling for her to get on the ground. Confused, terrified, and outraged, Dana complied. The next thing she knew, she was being handcuffed and hauled outside, while neighbors watched in horror. Some of them shouted in protest, insisting Dana was innocent, but the police bulldozed through, claiming they had a warrant and credible evidence. At the station, Dixon personally oversaw her booking. In a twisted display of mockery, he read out the charges: drug trafficking, possession with intent to distribute, conspiracy. The severity of these allegations was staggering, enough to ruin any person's life, let alone someone with aspirations of serving in the justice system. Dana felt dizzy, nauseous. She tried to protest, but Dixon and Carr smirked, ignoring her pleas. That same day, Judge Kyle Pratt, after receiving a hefty bribe and a discreet threat from Dixon, signed off on denying Dana bail. The official justification was that she posed a flight risk due to supposed ties with out-of-state criminals. It was a sham, but it worked. Dana Blake was taken away, locked in a holding cell, with none of her friends or family allowed to see her. Redwood Heights was stunned. How could this woman, a local role model, an activist, be involved in a high-level drug operation? The news spread like wildfire, the headlines in the Redwood Heights Gazette condemning her. Underneath all of it was a carefully orchestrated web of lies, quietly engineered by Dixon, Carr, and Judge Pratt. Dana was now at the center of an inferno, and she had no idea how she'd survive. In the claustrophobic confines of her holding cell, Dana felt a whirlwind of emotions: shock, fear, anger, and an unwavering sense of injustice. She knew she was innocent. Anyone who truly knew her was certain these charges were absurd. Yet the array of fabricated evidence, the burner phone, the alleged drug stash, the bogus financial documents pointed in one incriminating direction: her. For 3 days, she was largely isolated, allowed only a handful of short phone calls. Her grandmother, Bernice Black, pleaded with the police to let her see Dana, but the request was repeatedly denied. In the eyes of the corrupt system, Dana was suddenly a kingpin, a narrative that served to keep her locked up and cut off from support. On the rare occasions she was allowed out of her cell, she endured cold stares from guards and whispered taunts that she was a disgrace. Some officers looked at her with pity, convinced she'd been framed, but they were too afraid to speak up against Dixon and Carr. Despite the suffocating despair, Dana's mind refused to surrender. She'd studied criminal law. She knew how evidence could be manipulated. Instead of letting fear paralyze her, she began formulating ideas for her defense. She mentally noted all the possible ways she could prove her innocence: timestamps that didn't add up, witnesses who could place her elsewhere, community members who could vouch for her character, and any possible leads that might shed light on the real perpetrators behind this scheme. But time was not on her side. The more days she spent in detention, the more Redwood Heights turned against her. Online forums lit up with discussions, some outraged by her arrest, others swearing she was guilty. The local TV station regurgitated the police's story without question, fueling the rumor mill. The turning point came on the morning of her arraignment. Dana was finally escorted into a small, windowless meeting room, where her court-appointed attorney, Greg Winters, sat with a folder of legal documents. Greg was a young, earnest public defender, overwhelmed by a caseload too large for one person to manage effectively. Nonetheless, he believed in Dana's innocence from the moment he met her. "They have an overwhelming amount of evidence, Miss Blake," Greg said, flipping through the pages. His tone was grave, but something about it seems too neat. It's too perfectly laid out. Dana nodded. "That's because it's staged," she replied. "We have to prove it's fabricated. We have to find out who's behind this." Greg looked at her with sympathy. "We will try, but Judge Pratt has set a high bar. You've been denied bail. They're treating this as a major trafficking case. If we want to fight this, we'll need a lot of proof, and we'll need it quickly." In that moment, despite the suffocating bleakness, Dana felt a spark of hope. She was not alone. She had an ally, even if underfunded and overworked. And she had her own intelligence, her own resilience. She might have been trapped in a system designed to break her, but she was determined to fight back. She was determined to show Redwood Heights and the entire world just how far the corrupt would go to destroy an innocent life. While Dana braced herself for a legal battle, across town, Judge Kyle Pratt paced anxiously in his lavish home office. It was a room filled with dark mahogany furniture, thick Persian rugs, and a bookshelf packed with prestigious legal tomes, but none of that exuded comfort tonight. Pratt's nerves were frayed, and his palms were clammy with cold sweat. He had just finished a phone call with Detective Dixon. The detective's voice had been smug. Dixon assured him that if Pratt continued to play along, handing down harsh rulings, ignoring any inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence, he would receive a generous kickback once the dust settled. Dixon had even hinted at a future promotion that Pratt would benefit from if certain city positions opened up. But Pratt was deeply in debt, thanks to his crippling gambling addiction. His usual haunt was a hidden backroom casino on the outskirts of Redwood Heights, where he frequently lost thousands in a single night. The casino's loan sharks were circling, demanding payment. So when Dixon and Carr had approached him with an offer, a hefty sum in exchange for ensuring Dana Blake remained locked up and eventually found guilty, Pratt hadn't hesitated. Fear and greed were powerful motivators. Yet guilt gnawed at him. He was no stranger to questionable rulings, having taken bribes in smaller cases. But this was different. The entire community knew Dana Blake. The moral weight of framing an innocent woman for serious felonies pressed down on him more than he cared to admit. Every time he glanced at the framed photos on his desk, his smiling wife and his 2 young daughters, he felt a knot in his stomach. How could he face them, knowing what he was doing to someone else's child? Desperate for a momentary escape, Pratt poured himself a generous glass of bourbon, sipping it as he gazed out of the tall windows into his darkened yard. The city lights of Redwood Heights glittered in the distance, a stark reminder of how many souls lived under the mercy of a justice system that he was perverting. He tried to justify his actions. If I don't do this, the loan sharks will ruin me. Dixon will leak everything. I'll lose my career, my family, my reputation. That rationalization offered him little comfort. He was in a bind, one he'd spent years weaving through crooked deals and reckless bets. Now it was all culminating in this single high-profile injustice against Dana Blake. With a shaky hand, he finished his drink and set the glass down on his mahogany desk. Tomorrow, he would walk into the Redwood Heights courthouse to preside over Dana's initial hearing. Tomorrow, he would publicly brand an innocent woman a criminal, and he loathed himself for it. A silent vow formed in his mind. Just one last job. After this, I'm out. He deluded himself into thinking that once he cleared his debts, he could reform and leave the dirty dealings behind. But, as he'd learned soon enough, the price for redemption would be far higher than he could ever pay. While Dana sat in jail, the community she'd worked so hard to uplift did not remain silent. Over the years, Dana had built strong connections, neighborhood leaders, religious figures, local business owners, and civil rights activists who admired her commitment to justice. Word of her arrest spread like a brush fire, igniting outrage among those who knew her character firsthand. Every evening, small groups gathered outside the police station, holding candles and signs that declared "Free Dana Blake" and "Stop Corruption Now." The protests started out modest, just a dozen or so dedicated supporters, but their numbers swelled day by day. Soon, hundreds of voices rose up against the injustice. One of the most vocal supporters was Pastor Clyde Wright from the historical St. Elijah Baptist Church. During Sunday sermons, he openly criticized the police department's history of racism and demanded an independent investigation into Dana's case. Local journalists also began sniffing around. Although the big headlines still parroted the police narrative, a few reporters at the Redwood Heights Gazette grew suspicious. Dana Blake had once collaborated with them on a piece exposing poor living conditions in low-income housing. She had a reputation for integrity. Now, she was labeled a drug trafficker. It didn't add up. Journalists started digging, requesting documents, and speaking to neighbors who witnessed the raid. Inside the station, there were whispered conversations among a handful of honest officers who believed Dana was being framed. But fear hung heavy in the air. No one wanted to become Dixon and Carr's next target. Only one young officer, Amy Holden, dared to discreetly approach the protesters outside one night. She was new to the force and hadn't yet been hardened by the toxic culture. When one of Dana's friends recognized her, Amy quietly said, "I can't comment on the record, but don't stop what you're doing, protesting, demanding answers. It matters." Back in her cramped cell, Dana's own hope was rekindled by the faint sounds of chanting from outside. Through the small window in the corridor near the cell block, she could sometimes hear the protesters calling her name, demanding justice. That distant noise was like a lifeline. She realized she wasn't alone. The city she loved was fighting for her. Even if the system was stacked against her, her lawyer, Greg Winters, brought even more promising news. He'd filed a motion to dismiss based on inconsistencies in the police report. Though Judge Pratt would likely reject it, Greg was setting the groundwork for an appeal. He also mentioned that some local attorneys and civil rights groups were starting to take interest. In an ideal world, one of these groups might step in with resources and expertise, challenging the corruption at its roots. Dana clung to these rays of hope. Each sign of support, each mention of potential allies, bolstered her determination. She vowed that if she made it out of this ordeal, she would not only clear her name, but also tear down the network of corruption that had ensnared her. Redwood Heights deserved better, and she would fight tooth and nail to make sure the city saw the truth. As the case against Dana headed toward trial, Dixon and Carr ramped up their intimidation tactics. They threatened witnesses who dared to speak on Dana's behalf and manipulated evidence to withstand scrutiny from the defense. Judge Pratt complied with their every request in pretrial hearings, allowing questionable evidence while dismissing any sign of police misconduct as speculative. It seemed like a clean sweep for the corrupt trio, but cracks soon began to appear in their carefully orchestrated facade. One evening, Sergeant Eli Carr returned home to find a plain envelope slipped under his front door. Inside it was a single photograph of him and Dixon meeting with Judge Pratt in a dimly lit parking lot. On the back of the photo were typed words, "We know." No signature, no return address. Carr's heart pounded so fiercely he thought he might pass out. Who took this picture? How did they get it? He immediately called Dixon, who rushed over, anger twisting his features. They concluded someone was tailing them, collecting evidence of their conspiracy. Fearful that it might be an honest cop or a federal agent, they discussed potential suspects, racking their brains for who might stand to gain from their downfall. 2 days later, Judge Pratt received an anonymous email on his personal account. It contained the same photograph and a cryptic message. "Tick-tock, Judge. Truth is coming." Pratt nearly dropped his phone when he read it. Anxiety flared in his chest like a burning ember. He gulped down a glass of water, sweat beading on his forehead. In a panic, he tried to call Dixon, but the detective was tied up. Judge Pratt felt more alone than ever, snared in a tightening web of his own making. Meanwhile, Officer Amy Holden continued observing the mounting tensions at the station. She noticed Dixon's uncharacteristic scowl, Carr's abrupt outbursts, and the hush-hush murmurs that followed them wherever they went. Feeling emboldened, Amy decided to dig deeper. Late at night, she combed through internal files, looking for any record that might indicate tampering in Dana's case. What she found were glaring inconsistencies, mismatched evidence logs, conflicting statements from officers, and timestamps that made no sense. She printed out a few key documents and hid them in her locker, her heart pounding with both excitement and dread. In her cell, Dana prayed for just one piece of exonerating evidence. She knew that if even the slightest discrepancy came to light, it could open the floodgates to prove her innocence. Every night, she tried to calm the swirling questions in her mind. Who set me up? How deep does this conspiracy go? She had her suspicions about Dixon, but proving it was another matter entirely. The cracks were growing, even though Dana couldn't see them yet. The photograph, Amy Holden's internal discoveries, these were small but critical signs that the once invincible conspirators were losing control. Karma was stirring in Redwood Heights, and with each passing day, it crept a little closer. The tension in Redwood Heights escalated as Dana's trial date approached. On the one side were Dixon, Carr, and Judge Pratt, who continued to push their narrative of Dana's guilt. On the other side were Dana's supporters, growing louder and more organized. The protests outside the courthouse swelled, signs demanding justice multiplied, and local musicians performed songs of resistance during rallies. A grassroots movement formed, calling for an independent oversight committee to investigate police corruption. Into this fray stepped an unexpected ally, a high-profile civil rights attorney named Ellen Peterson from the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU. The Redwood Heights Gazette had forwarded copies of the police files to her office, highlighting suspicious details in Dana's case. Intrigued, Peterson traveled to Redwood Heights to meet with Dana and her public defender, Greg Winters. In the cramped visitors' room of the jail, Peterson's presence was a breath of fresh air. She was a seasoned professional, sharp-eyed and calm-voiced, her gray hair pinned back in a neat bun. As she listened to Dana recount her story, her activism, the antagonism from Dixon, the suspicious raid, Peterson's expression grew increasingly grim. "We need to dig deeper," she concluded. "This isn't just a wrongful arrest. This is a systemic pattern. If we can prove one instance of fabrication, it could expose many more." Dana felt a surge of hope. With the ACLU on her side, she might finally stand a chance against Redwood Heights' machinery of corruption. Meanwhile, Dixon and Carr were desperate to identify the source of the leaked photograph. They cornered potential whistleblowers in the precinct, made vague threats, and even searched the station surveillance footage to see who might have been snooping around. Officer Amy Holden narrowly escaped suspicion by keeping a low profile and carefully covering her tracks. Judge Pratt, racked with guilt and paranoia, found himself sleeping less and drinking more. His wife noticed his erratic behavior, but he brushed off her concerns, blaming work stress. In private, though, he was close to a breakdown. He'd begun receiving additional anonymous threats via text messages, each one hinting at the damning evidence that could surface at any moment. It's too late, he thought in moments of crushing despair. I've thrown in my lot with devils, and I have to see this through. Underneath all the chaos, Redwood Heights braced itself for the trial. Journalists from nearby cities started showing interest, sensing a scandal brewing. Talk show hosts invited civil rights activists to discuss the case, highlighting the long history of racially biased policing in communities like Redwood Heights. For Dana, the trial represented a battle for her very life. For Dixon, Carr, and Pratt, it was a chance to solidify their hold on power or lose everything. As the days ticked by, both sides prepared their strategies. Unbeknownst to them, fate had already begun turning the gears of their downfall. The morning of the trial dawned with a kind of electric tension that crackled in the air. Crowds packed the sidewalks in front of the Redwood Heights courthouse, where Judge Pratt had been appointed to preside for the high-profile case. Riot police stood by warily, anticipating large protests. News vans lined the street, satellite dishes aimed skyward to beam every development to viewers across the state. Dana arrived in a police transport van, her hands cuffed in front of her. Dressed in a conservative blue blazer and skirt provided by her grandmother, she held her head high despite the cameras flashing in her face. Inside the courtroom, she took her seat at the defense table, beside Greg Winters and Ellen Peterson, who had joined as co-counsel. On the other side of the aisle, the prosecution team, handpicked by Dixon, organized their files, while Dixon and Carr sat smugly in the gallery, wearing suits to play the role of concerned investigators. Judge Pratt entered the courtroom with a rigid posture. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless nights. The deputy district attorney opened by painting a damning picture. Dana Blake, once seen as a pillar of the community, was accused of masterminding a drug operation. Their argument hinged on the mountain of evidence discovered in her home and the anonymous tip that set the raid in motion. Ellen Peterson delivered a scathing rebuttal. She calmly explained how easy it was to fabricate evidence, how improbable it was for a woman with Dana's background to abruptly become a drug kingpin, and how the Redwood Heights Police Department had a documented history of misconduct. She stopped just short of calling it a setup, but her tone left little doubt in anyone's mind. Judge Pratt maintained an outward facade of impartiality, granting each side the opportunity to present opening arguments. But he occasionally issued rulings that favored the prosecution, in line with his secret deal with Dixon. He allowed certain pieces of questionable evidence to be admitted, overruling Peterson's objections. The defense team exchanged knowing glances. They could see they were up against more than just the prosecution. They were up against the presiding judge as well. Outside, the protest continued to swell. Pastor Clyde Wright led a group in prayer, chanting justice for Dana. Others held signs demanding no more framed cases. The atmosphere was charged, and one could almost taste the tension in the air. Dana watched it all unfold with a mixture of dread and resolve. She occasionally glanced at Judge Pratt, wondering if the rumor of his corruption was true. She studied Dixon and Carr, their smug faces exuding confidence. Did they really believe they could bury her without consequence? As the day's proceedings came to a close, the courtroom buzzed with speculation. The prosecution's case seemed airtight on the surface, but Peterson and Winters knew that the truth was far more complicated. They believed that with enough cross-examination and the right evidence, the cracks would begin to show. The battle lines were drawn, and neither side had any intention of giving up. Thus, day one of the trial ended under a maelstrom of controversy, with Redwood Heights holding its breath for the next chapter in this fight for justice. Day two of the trial started with the prosecution calling their star witnesses, officers involved in the raid on Dana's apartment. They testified about the supposed tip-off, the suspicious items found, and how Dana looked nervous and agitated during her arrest. On the surface, their accounts seemed to align perfectly with the fabricated evidence, but during cross-examination, Ellen Peterson relentlessly probed for details. "Officer Grant, can you clarify the time stamp on the body camera footage?" she asked, a polite smile masking her intensity. The officer fumbled slightly, then gave an approximate time. Peterson brought out a copy of the official arrest report. Interesting, she said. Because your body cam shows you entering the building at 9:52 p.m., but the arrest report claims that the raid began at 10:15 p.m., which is accurate. The confusion on the witness stand was evident. It was a minor discrepancy, but it planted the seed that the officers' stories might not be as consistent as they claimed. Sergeant Carr, who testified next, tried to maintain a calm demeanor. Peterson, however, grilled him on the chain of custody for the cocaine found in Dana's apartment. "Tell me, Sergeant," she said, "how is it that the evidence log shows you signed for the substance at 10:02 p.m., yet the police transport logs indicate you left the scene at 10:05 p.m.? A hush fell over the courtroom. Carr stuttered, searching for a plausible explanation, but none came. Though these inconsistencies might seem small on their own, each undermined the prosecution's grand narrative. Judge Pratt repeatedly interrupted Peterson with warnings, but she pressed on, determined to expose every gap in the facade. Meanwhile, Dixon, who observed from the gallery, clenched his jaw. He could sense the defense punching holes in the carefully orchestrated story. He tapped his foot nervously, stealing glances at Judge Pratt as if to say, "Do something." But even Pratt couldn't outright dismiss these discrepancies without drawing suspicion. Outside the courtroom, the mood among the protesters was one of cautious optimism. News of the defense's incisive cross-examination spread quickly. Pastor Wright urged everyone to keep praying, to keep believing justice would be served. Officer Amy Holden, lingering at the edge of the crowd, quietly handed an envelope to a local community organizer. Inside were copies of documents highlighting more contradictions in the official police statements. Amy's heart pounded with a mix of fear and resolve. If Dixon discovered what she'd done, she could lose her job, or worse. But the thought of an innocent woman going to prison was something she couldn't stomach. By the end of day 2, the prosecution's once solid foundation was showing hairline fractures, yet the biggest reveal was still to come. Peterson and Winters had hinted at a surprise witness, someone whose testimony could blow the case wide open. Speculation ran wild. Was it a police informant? A colleague of Dana's who could vouch for her whereabouts? As Redwood Heights went to sleep that night, one thing was certain. The narrative carefully crafted by Dixon, Carr, and Judge Pratt was in danger of unraveling, and if it did, the fallout would be monumental. On the third day of the trial, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Whispers circulated about the defense's rumored surprise witness. Dana sat rigidly, her palms sweating against the tabletop. She saw Dixon and Carr exchange uneasy glances across the aisle. Judge Pratt tried to maintain an impassive expression, but his twitching fingers drumming on the bench betrayed his anxiety. After a morning of procedural testimonies, Ellen Peterson rose and announced, "Your Honor, the defense would like to call Officer Amy Holden to the stand." A ripple of shock swept through the courtroom. Dixon's eyes flared in fury. Carr looked as though he'd been sucker punched. Judge Pratt's heart pounded. He knew that letting a police officer testify on behalf of the defense was unusual, but he had no legal grounds to refuse. Officer Holden stepped forward, her face reflecting a mix of fear and determination. She took the oath and settled into the witness chair. Peterson began by establishing Amy's credentials and the timeline of events as she knew them. Then she gently guided the conversation toward the documents Amy had discovered: mismatched files, altered timestamps, and logs that hinted at evidence tampering. "What made you suspicious, Officer Holden?" Peterson asked. Amy swallowed hard. "I noticed that the official timeline for the raid on Miss Blake's apartment didn't match the dispatch records. When I tried to verify the evidence custody logs, I found multiple edits. Everything seemed too clean on paper, but the records themselves told a different story." Murmurs spread through the audience. Dixon's face was set in a grimace, while Carr stared daggers at Amy. Peterson presented several internal police documents that Amy had provided. Timestamps contradicted official statements. Chain of custody forms bore multiple erasures. She also presented transcripts of communications supposedly sent by Dana from a burner phone, yet the phone company's records showed no activity at those times. Judge Pratt was forced to allow each piece of evidence. Even he couldn't find a procedural excuse to suppress it all. His earlier favoritism toward the prosecution was blatant enough. He had to appear somewhat impartial or risk immediate backlash from the legal community and the media. Tension peaked when Amy admitted she believed the drugs found in Dana's apartment were planted. She stopped short of naming Dixon and Carr directly, likely out of fear, but the implication hung in the air like a storm cloud. The courtroom erupted in gasps, and Judge Pratt had to pound his gavel to restore order. Dixon and Carr exchanged panicked looks. This was the moment they dreaded, the public unraveling of their carefully staged narrative. If the jury believed Amy's testimony and the incriminating documents, Dana would almost certainly be cleared of all charges. Worse yet, an investigation into police corruption would follow, possibly leading to indictments against them. In the span of a single witness's testimony, the tide turned decisively in Dana's favor. Eyes were no longer fixated on the defendant's alleged wrongdoing, but on the shadowy actions of the Redwood Heights Police Department. And Judge Pratt, sitting at the bench, felt his world crumbling beneath him. He had sold his soul to Dixon's bribes only to watch the case, and perhaps his entire career, slip out of his control. Word of Officer Amy Holden's explosive testimony swept through Redwood Heights like wildfire. By the time court recessed for the day, the crowd outside the Redwood Heights courthouse had doubled. Chance of justice for Dana grew more fervent, and even those who had initially doubted her innocence began to reconsider their positions. The story dominated the local evening news, with talking heads analyzing the significance of a police officer testifying against her own department. Inside the police station, a palpable tension filled the halls. Some officers felt vindicated. Finally, someone had the courage to expose the corruption they'd suspected. Others, especially those loyal to Dixon and Carr, raged about traitors. Dixon stormed around barking orders and threatening subordinates if they dared to cooperate with the defense. Carr tried to project confidence, but the shakiness in his voice betrayed him. Everyone knew this wasn't just about one officer's testimony. It was about whether an entire structure of lies would come crashing down. Judge Pratt found himself trapped in a nightmare. Alone in his chambers, he paced back and forth, beads of sweat forming on his brow. He was fully aware that Amy's testimony could open Pandora's box. If an internal affairs investigation began, it wouldn't be long before the bribes and blackmail against him were discovered. Pratt grabbed his phone and dialed Dixon's number. "Fix this," Pratt hissed the moment Dixon picked up. "If this goes any further, we're all ruined." "I'm working on it," Dixon replied through gritted teeth. "Just do your job from the bench." The call ended abruptly. Pratt sank into his chair, staring at the pile of documents on his desk. He was in too deep to back out now, but continuing down this path felt like standing on a collapsing bridge. That evening, Dana, back in her cell, sat with Ellen Peterson and Greg Winters, who had arranged a late meeting with her. Though still confined, Dana's spirit soared. She knew the jury had seen a glimpse of the truth. Peterson, her eyes bright with conviction, told Dana, "We found threads of evidence tampering. We can use Officer Holden's testimony to push for a forensic analysis of the supposed drug stash and the phone records. If the judge refuses, we'll appeal immediately." Dana pressed her hands together, a mixture of relief and apprehension filling her. "Thank you," she whispered. "I knew the truth would come out, but I can't rest yet. They might have more tricks up their sleeve." Greg nodded. "We can't get complacent. Dixon and Carr won't go down without a fight." And Judge Pratt. He paused, exchanging a knowing look with Peterson. "He's compromised. One wrong move, and he could throw this trial off the rails." Despite the uncertainty, Dana felt a growing sense of vindication. She wasn't alone. She had a skilled legal team, a courageous ally in the police force, and a community standing behind her. The shadow of injustice was still looming, but the light of truth had broken through, and it shone brighter with every passing day. The trial's final act arrived on a crisp morning. Supporters, onlookers, and the press flooded the courthouse, eager for the day's proceedings. The defense had submitted a motion requesting immediate forensic tests on all evidence, particularly the substance seized from Dana's apartment. The lab results came in just in time for the final arguments. The white powder was indeed baking soda, not cocaine, a bombshell revelation that slammed into the prosecution's case like a wrecking ball. Dixon and Carr, seated in the gallery, exchanged looks of sheer panic. They watched as the prosecution scrambled to contain the fallout. The deputy district attorney stammered his way through an explanation that there must have been some mix-up at the lab, but the jury wasn't buying it. The seeds of doubt had been sown too deeply. Eyes turned toward the Redwood Heights Police Department, suspecting corruption rather than incompetence. Ellen Peterson rose for her closing argument, her voice resonating through the hushed courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have seen overwhelming evidence that points to one conclusion. Dana Blake was framed. Officer Amy Holden courageously testified about inconsistencies in the police logs. We now know the drugs found in Miss Blake's apartment weren't drugs at all. The timeline provided by the arresting officers has been dismantled piece by piece. Why? Because it was carefully constructed to convict an innocent woman. She gestured toward Dana, whose eyes shimmered with tears of gratitude. This is not just about Dana Blake. This is about justice in Redwood Heights. It's about whether we allow corrupt officials to pervert our legal system for their own ends. Today, you have the power to correct a terrible wrong. When Peterson finished, the courtroom broke into spontaneous applause, swiftly silenced by Judge Pratt's gavel. His face was pale, and sweat beaded at his temple. He forced an official tone. Order. The jury will disregard the applause. We will have closing arguments from the prosecution now. Yet his voice trembled, betraying his inner turmoil. The deputy district attorney tried to salvage what was left of the case, but he might as well have been trying to hold back a dam bursting with cracks. The jury looked skeptical, their gazes heavy with contempt for the flimsy explanations. Dixon's face was turning a splotchy red. Carr's shoulders slumped in defeat. At last, the jury left to deliberate. Whispers filled the courtroom, speculations swirling about how long they would need. Dana gripped her attorney's hand, nerves on edge. Peterson squeezed back, whispering, "Have faith." Across the aisle, Dixon and Carr glared at the defense table, seething. Less than 2 hours later, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, clearing her throat. She glanced at Dana, then at Judge Pratt, and finally announced, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Dana Blake, not guilty on all counts." Cheers erupted in the gallery. People clapped, hugged, and wept. Dana exhaled a breath she felt she'd been holding for weeks, tears rolling down her cheeks. Yet the surprise was not over. As the courtroom broke into celebration, officers suddenly approached Dixon and Carr. A stern-faced internal affairs officer strode forward, accompanied by uniformed state troopers. "Detective Kurt Dixon, Sergeant Eli Carr," he declared, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and perjury." The hush that fell next was deafening. Dixon sprang up, fury contorting his face. "You can't do this. I'm a decorated officer." The troopers wrestled him into handcuffs, ignoring his protests. Carr, ashen and shaken, offered no resistance. The hush broke into a roar of shock as photographers clicked wildly, capturing the moment Redwood Heights' biggest bullies were hauled away. Judge Pratt looked like he might faint. He fumbled with his gavel, knocking it off the bench. A bailiff retrieved it for him. The judge's voice cracked as he announced, "Court is adjourned." He tried to hurry off the bench, but he found himself face to face with the same internal affairs officer. "Judge Pratt, we have some questions for you," the officer said, eyes gleaming with the anticipation of pulling back the curtain on the judge's complicity. The disheveled judge stared wide-eyed, sweat coursing down his face. He tried to stammer out a response, but all that emerged were choked syllables. The officer gestured for him to follow. Pratt swallowed hard, like a man marching toward his doom. As the courtroom began to empty, Dana was escorted out as well, not by handcuffs, but by a flood of supporters, friends, and well-wishers. Ellen Peterson and Greg Winters stayed close, sheltering her from the barrage of reporters thrusting microphones into her face. Questions flew like arrows. "How do you feel about the verdict? Did you know Dixon and Carr were framing you all along? What's your next step?" Dana, tears still on her cheeks, paused to address the crowd outside the courthouse. Flashbulbs lit the dusk sky. Her voice shook at first, but then gained strength. "I'm thankful that justice prevailed today, but this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring no one else in Redwood Heights, or anywhere, becomes the victim of corrupt officials who hide behind a badge or a robe. I plan to use my voice to make sure this never happens again." The crowd erupted in applause. People surged forward, hugging her and patting her back. Among them stood Bernice, Dana's grandmother, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "I knew you'd come out on top, baby," she whispered, pulling Dana into a fierce embrace. "I always believed in you." In the days that followed, Redwood Heights witnessed a firestorm of repercussions. Dixon, Carr, and Judge Pratt faced criminal charges. Internal Affairs launched a sweeping investigation into the Redwood Heights Police Department, uncovering years of abuse, false arrests, and extortion. Other officers came forward, emboldened by Amy Holden's example. The city council held emergency meetings, pledging to install an independent oversight commission. Dana's name was cleared, but her mission was just beginning. She became a local hero, an emblem of resilience and moral fortitude. Offers poured in from law firms and advocacy groups. The ACLU recommended her for a position at their regional office, but Dana had other plans. She wanted to stay in Redwood Heights, to restore the place she called home, to enact real change within a broken system. Then came the twist no one saw coming. Less than a month after the trial, the Redwood Heights District Attorney announced a sweeping restructuring to root out corruption. To everyone's astonishment, they appointed Dana Blake as a special investigator overseeing the department she had once dreamed of joining. She would have the power to audit cases, investigate wrongdoing, and recommend criminal charges against officers who abused their authority. The city marveled at the poetic justice. The same woman once framed by crooked cops would now be in a position to rebuild the department from the ground up. The day Dana walked into her new office at the Redwood Heights Police Department, formerly Dixon's domain, she felt a blend of triumph and humility. She stood in the hallway, staff members pausing in their tracks to watch her. Some wore wary expressions, others offered smiles of genuine respect. As she approached the corner office, she froze. The nameplate on the door read, Special Investigator, Dana Blake. She placed a trembling hand on it, tears threatening to spill. In that moment, memories flashed. Her arrest, the cold holding cell, the humiliating strip search, the shock of hearing the fabricated charges. Now, those events had led her here, to a seat of influence she could wield for good. Her first order of business was to reorganize the oversight process. She scheduled a meeting with the department's leadership, setting a tone of accountability and transparency. She also called Officer Amy Holden into her office to thank her personally for her courage. Amy stepped in, hat in hand, still looking nervous. "You changed everything," Dana said, meeting her gaze steadily. "Because of you, the truth came out." Amy smiled sheepishly. "I just did what was right. This place, it can be better, but only if we root out all the bad apples." "We will," Dana promised. Together, she thought. She thought back to Dixon and Carr. Word on the street was that they'd been denied bail, ironically enough, due to being flight risks. Judge Pratt's trial loomed on the horizon, and the media was already dubbing it the biggest corruption scandal Redwood Heights had ever seen. The city braced for more revelations of bribery, misconduct, and vile racism. Dana vowed to stand firm, shining a light wherever darkness thrived. In the aftermath, Redwood Heights began its slow journey toward reform. Police officers underwent new training programs focused on racial equity and community engagement. Community leaders, once sidelined, found seats at advisory boards. The Redwood Heights Gazette published a series of exposés on systemic injustice, calling it the city's necessary reckoning. Though the wounds ran deep, the city dared to hope for a future free from the long shadow of corruption. And at the heart of it all stood Dana Blake, a testament to the power of truth, courage, and resilience. She had gone from prisoner to protector, from scapegoat to savior. Her voice, once almost silenced by hateful schemes, now rang out with authority. The once racist cops who tried to destroy her now sat in jail awaiting trial, powerless and exposed. The judge who sold his honor for bribes faced his own day of reckoning. In that sense, it was a story of karma coming full circle, in a place where justice had once been sold to the highest bidder. An innocent woman rose to dismantle the very system that almost crushed her. Dana Blake's story became legend in Redwood Heights, reminding everyone that even in the face of enormous corruption, truth finds a way. And sometimes, it does so with a dramatic flourish that no one could have predicted. Thank you for joining us on this epic journey through corruption, betrayal, and ultimate redemption. Dana Blake's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a reminder that injustice can be overturned when good people stand up for what's right. From the shocking setup by racist cops to the triumphant moment she rose to a position of power, every chapter reminds us that truth and accountability will prevail, even against the darkest schemes. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think twice about the power structures we all live under, Let's keep the conversation going. Please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories of justice and hope. Together, we can shine a light on corruption and uplift the heroes who fight for a fairer world. Thank you for watching.